last talk. Greatly appreciate it. So for those that you don't know me, my name is Jake Kouns. I'm Director of Cybersecurity. Yes, cyber's in my title. Cybersecurity and technology underwriting risk for an insurance company called Markel. But I also run the Open Security Foundation, where we track a lot of data breaches and vulnerabilities and things of that nature. So today I'd like to, we don't have a long session, but I'd like to try to have a little bit of a discussion with you guys also. Feel free to chime in, and I know there's several in the room that have no problem with doing that, so definitely welcome. But I want to talk a little bit about big data and big liability. And I was a little surprised that it was the only talk that had big data in the title. And I could have made it just a little bit better if it was big data, big cyber liability, throwing cyber in there, but I figured I would hold off on that. So, all right. So I want to get going here. And we're going to start off with a little bit of, it's the end of the day, we'll get the blood moving a little bit. So feel free to chime in and tell me what you think. What's better, right? So what's better? Small ice cream cone or big ice cream cone? Big, right? I feel like if I got a little kiddie table and I sat down here and I called a couple people up, we could reenact that AT&T commercial, right? What's better? Small beer or big keg with lots of beer? There we go, right? Little moped, small moped, big motorcycle. All right, there we go. What about small stack of money or big stack of money? You guys are... This is what I call small data or big data. What's better? Someone's had to say small data here, right? Isn't that one of the biggest debates, small versus big data? No? Usable, maybe? Okay. All right, so is bigger always better? You think so? You guys are definitely staring at me today. Maybe? It seems to be the case these days. People keep talking about big data, right? All right, so bigger always better. I guess we'll think that's the case, right? So doctor's stolen laptop at a pawn shop, 620 or 52 patients exposed. Is that better? Or maybe devices lost containing 800,000 users' data. What's better here? Is bigger better? Bigger better? No? Maybe not? I don't know, bore you with a couple more. Breach exposes 1,000 county workers. Or 350,000 Social Security numbers exposed. Is bigger better here? No. Maybe not. What about this one? Hackers raid a database with 654,000 Social Security numbers? Or personal data of 2.4 million voters at risk? Is bigger better? Would you prefer one over the other? Can you believe as an industry we're actually maybe even comparing it? I would take the lower one of this with that much data exposed? No? Maybe? Forget Canada? Hey, I didn't say that. I didn't say it. All right, so maybe bigger is not always better, right? And we've had some great talks from the keynotes. I enjoyed Wendy's talk. I hope this is a discussion that continues on about a little bit more about data, right? So the case for big data, and I'm more than happy for you real hardcore big data people to speak up here, right? But let's talk for a second about the case for big data. So people always are saying, hey, this is providing, the data is going to provide new insights into maybe customers' wants or their behaviors, right? That sort of seems what we're trying to figure out. We want the ability to make better and, in many people's mind, more profitable decisions when using data, right? Now here we get into the small versus big data argument. I think you'll have a lot of people that would argue that small data actually powers big data, so you kind of have to have small data to get the big data maybe. But we're seeing more and more people that are now saying that aggregation of more will give you these better business intelligence, right? So you're starting to roll back to more, and bigger is better in this case. But I think that pretty much all of us would say that whether it's big or small data, without some type of ability to make decisions or to help you make decisions, there really isn't that much business value or little business value in the data alone. I think we all can agree that data has value, but it's clear that the data that we are storing, that we are using, there's responsibility there, and therefore liability that you as an organization have to have, right? Anyone else have any thoughts on what the value of big data is? Go for it.
Again, it depends on usability and like what kind of data it is. If you get like a small amount of data with high value targets in it versus a lot of data with shoe size.
Okay. So I think maybe your point is it's more the quality of the data and what you're getting rather than just large chunks. But I think it comes back to being able to do something with the data still. Roger?
Big data is kind of a hedge against the future that you haven't figured out how to question yet.
Okay. Okay.
So there's this notion the answer will be in the data if we can figure out the right question.
The answer will be in the data. Okay. So store all the things, right? And then we're going to figure out later what the heck we're going to do with it. I think that's sort of what you were suggesting, right? So we think that data is valuable. I think it's proven that in certain cases. And so the more data that we have, the more valuable it has to be for our organizations. Do you think this is the strategy for big data for most folks? Maybe. Lots of heads shaking up and down. Let's just store as much as we can, right? I told you the data hoarders was in here. A little bit of a different picture, but let me ask, do we have any people in here that will admit you're a data hoarder? Come on. I know you would do. All right. So we have quite a few people that are going to admit they're a data hoarder and that you want this data because you do think there's value in there. And whether the value is what you have now or what you think could be there, you'd rather have maybe the data than not, right? You never know when you're going to need that thing. And maybe you should hang on to it. So store everything possible when you talk to folks that are really in the big data area. It's kind of for a ready source of data, right? You want to have this data available to you. And it allows for ideas to be quickly tested. So if you have some crazy idea that maybe we could chain data or look for this here or do that, you don't have to send, oh, now I got to go find some data. You've been collecting absolutely everything. And now you can start to test these things, right? And so we're seeing this, companies that are that's a clear strategy. Store as much as they can get, and then they'll try to sort out what it is. Or give it to your data visualization analyst guy and say, hey, find me some answers in there. I think there's a few in this room that would agree with that, right? You get a pile of stuff, and I want you to turn it into some actionable things to make us some money, right? Again, the small focus data, and I think this is maybe to your comment that maybe a smaller focused data set might be able to drive those same decisions or similar decision. And I think if you look at that in terms of our comparisons, that might be with less liability. When you talk to some big data type people, some of the reactions that you get, less data fields, I'd rather have more. And now are you saying I need to reduce my sample size? Is that what you're saying? Because does that make my decisions less reliable? So in the eyes of the folks trying to determine what these actionable decisions are, it's the more that we have, the better, right? And I know there's some hardcore people in here about data, and you always want a bigger data set, and it's never big enough. It's not perfect data. So you want to get as much as you can, right? So you start getting into these little contradictions. But I think a point that I'm trying to get across is that storing everything means that you are taking on additional liability for no clear business reason at that point in time. It's not to say that there might not be value, but at that point in time you are taking on some type of liability for the hope that you might figure something out, right? Okay. So types of big data. I'm calling these, for lack of anything more creative, the traditional data types as we think about it, right? So, the PII, the NPI, those types of things, the names, the addresses, your phone numbers, financial records, banking, credit cards that we've been talking about, we can't even protect those. Social Security number or non-U.S. equivalent, medical information, usernames and passwords, and when you're also talking about big data, log data, that's always in people's minds about log data, right? Is this pretty much what people think about when you think traditional data sources? Classic data, right? Okay? So let's talk a little bit for a second here and hopefully have a little discussion about some of the non-traditional, or maybe non-classic might be better, or something more creative. Yeah, exactly. Web browsing data, right? Right? We want to start collecting this. We want to see where people are going, what they're doing. Phone call, texting, anything related to, again, history of what's going on. Wi-Fi data, GPS data, check-in data, all these types of additional things that you might not think of, but companies are starting to see value in having this as well. User profile information, pictures, using user profiles, pictures, right? We've seen this come up. User-generated content, social, data mining, social network stuff. For use that travel, frequent flyer programs, reward cards, shopping tracking. Does anyone use those grocery store rewards cards? You do, right? Are some of you the ones that say, I forgot mine, can you scan yours for me, please? There we go, right? Because now we're incenting people, right? Because if you scan that thing, you see the money come on, ooh, I need this card, right? So these organizations want data, they're willing to show some type of value to you to get this data, right? Anything else you guys can think of in this space? Thoughts on other non-traditional data that people are after?
Just low-level network traffic.
Network traffic?
I think Google is probably saving everything that goes by, aren't they?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Say again? Charges of shopping, maybe, the credit cards? Yep. Okay. Sure, your patterns? Anything else? Anything behavioral. So, this list could be huge then, right? Anything you say could be, if we could get our hands on it, be something we want to potentially track. All right, have you seen this? This was just the other day, an article out. Facebook will peer into your grocery bag to sell an ad to you. So now they have a partner network set up. They announced this system that lets advertisers target you based on additional things, right? So we're starting to see more of this pattern now where maybe the grocery store was just collecting information about you, but now that's starting to be pulled together so that they can target what you were buying, right? And it comes out. So we are seeing maybe more of this data that you thought, well, what are they going to do with that little card that I have? What can they do with that, right? So it's interesting to start to see these things pull together. So cost of big data. Creepy Willy Wonka says, oh, your data is missing. Nobody might have predicted that might happen, right? So does anyone in here think it's impossible that the data that your organization has just might go missing? Could never happen to you? Well, no one's going to raise their hand, and none of you did. Thank you very much. So again, we now in our minds think that, hey, there's a real potential that what we store could go missing, and we're storing more and more and more stuff. Okay? So consequences of a breach, I'm not going to get into any religious debates about the cost of a breach. We've beaten that one to death, and we're not going to rehash that one. But I think that we can all agree that there are consequences to a data breach, right? So the clear ones are some of those, direct first-party costs that we say, the notification, the credit monitoring. There's now the identity restoration, identity protection services are becoming pretty hot. Forensics costs, data restoration costs if something goes wrong. Theft of monies and securities, not everyone really can put that one together because I think most people believe that, because your credit cards have kind of taught you about fraud, that if you have something that goes missing, that money just comes back to you easily. So it may be a little bit of a headache if something bad happens to you, but at the end of the day, when your money comes back, well, there's still a lot of debate from a legal standpoint for companies. So if money goes missing from a company's bank account, those same protections aren't necessarily there. We've seen several lawsuits going on where a small company gets infected with something like Zeus. Money gets wired out. The bank says, hey, you logged in and told me you wanted your money to go away. We're not going to reimburse you for that. So again, another potentially unexpected cost. Lawsuits, legal fees for defense, damages and settlement. We'll get into some other things here where it doesn't necessarily mean you've done anything wrong, but you're still going to have to defend in a potential lawsuit. And then actions, payment of fines and penalties, we're seeing more of that pop up. For a while there was always threat of, we might have a HIPAA high-tech fine, but it wasn't happening, but now we're starting to see some of this come to reality. So store all the things sort of goes against a sensible records management program, right? Keep everything forever instead of what we've kind of always talked and went through, which was instead keep only what you need for the time that you need it. So we're seeing some things maybe circle back around that I feel like we've already been there and done that, but now it's coming back around with this big data. So keeping everything does have implications beyond maybe the actual cost of storage. So we could sort of conclude or argue that since there's cost associated with the data, maybe you should assess prior before storing it. Before you do store all the things, maybe you should assess that. If you talk to a lot of people trying to determine what the value is in the data, they might just not care about that because it would be hard to determine what the business value is if we go back to that store everything, figure it out later kind of mentality.
Just like to make a comment about one of your points there.
Sure.
20 years ago, or 25 when the first PCs came out, 10 megabyte hard drive option for an IBM PC cost a couple $1,000.
Yep.
And one of the huge drivers behind all of this is, I guess, storage is what, less than 50 cents a gigabyte now?
Yep.
So, I mean, just the change over my lifetime has been unthinkable.
Yeah. And I have a bullet later, but I'll talk about this now. It's just,
sorry, I didn't mean to try.
No, not at all. You may hear people sometimes say disk is cheap, but storage is expensive. And so, it's one thing if you're working in an organization and you're telling executives, hey, it's going to cost thousands and thousands of dollars for me to get this storage. And they say, well, I can go to, electronics store down the road and get a couple terabyte for $100. Where are these additional costs? Well, they're not backing up. They're not all these other things. So we're seeing low cost of storage regardless. But the disk itself perhaps is low. But then when you start adding maybe some of the things, maybe it's not as cheap as just the disk. But it does encourage a lot more storage, right? Any other thoughts so far? Everyone's still awake, which is good. All right, so let's talk a little bit about hidden big data costs. And I don't know if there's so much hidden. I don't know if ignored's the right word, or maybe something else here. But let's just for a second talk about email retention and archiving, right? So who here in your organization has an email retention policy? Pretty much all of you have one now, right? Okay. Some of you don't. I see some maybe not. But in general, I think most people went through we're going to store all our emails forever because you never know when you might need to pull that CYA email back up and figure out what's happening, right? Then we started seeing some lawsuits and other things happen that perhaps having all these emails forever wasn't really necessarily the greatest idea. People were finding things, and maybe some things that were out of context, or maybe they were just things that really you shouldn't have been doing, right? And it was causing problems. So then you see companies overreact and say, you can't store any emails, right? You're going to delete them within 10 days or whatever it is. And we're starting to see companies come in on some type of what we'll say reasonable records management program where they're based on the type of data and the need of that data, how long it should be stored. Yes?
In the state of Texas, Governor Rick Perry's office decided to have an email retention period of 7 days.
7 days.
And that so enraged a couple of people that one actually started filing public information act requests on the email so that they would have to retain it every week.
Ouch.
So they sent one
Every 7 days to keep it. So yeah, that's amazing. So I think, but people are still trying to figure out how long to store some of these things, right? And some of what I'll say, again, for a lack of better terms, these hidden costs maybe influence us. So some things are listed up here. Costs associated as part of a lawsuit. You start getting involved with lawsuits. Lawyers now, they seem to be kind of funny. They just say, e-discovery. And next thing you know, you're starting to have to spend all this time to go through all the documents that you have. Recreating data from old systems. We've seen lawsuits that have come up where it's an old email system, and they're saying, well, you still have that somewhere on backup tape. We'd like to go through those emails. So now are you actually going to recreate these systems for them to go through? And it sort of strikes me as we've been through this in the email section before, and now we're doing the same thing in the big data area. One of the other things that I've heard argued a little bit, let's say you have a 7-day email retention policy like you suggested, but on your big data you're storing everything forever. Now you have a disconnect in your storage or your retention policies. Why is that? And where some people might say, for legal defense or whatnot, we store this data because it's reasonable cost. It's unreasonable for us to restore these systems and go through it. You're sort of now saying that you have the capabilities and you should have been doing it on this side. So it's starting to create a little disconnect in organizations, I think, and lawyers are starting to pick up on this. Any other thoughts on hidden costs? Yes?
Well, it's just an anecdote. I don't know if people know Madoff, the guy that did the big scheme at Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
There was a warehouse in New York. He had every single computing device he had ever owned since 30 years before.
Yep.
And so the cost they incurred in the prosecution, they brought in people who still knew how to run PDP-8s, PDP whatevers, old deck systems, everything,
Yeah.
right up to the modern day. And he probably wishes now
You would have gotten rid of it all.
he had thrown some of that stuff in the river.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other thoughts on this?
I did have one more comment.
Sure.
I think the people I talk to, it's a very slow process with the legal system, but I think they're starting to come around a little bit on understanding you can't just issue a blanket subpoena for e-discovery and fish for 10 million electronic documents.
Yep. Yep.
It just, nobody can deal with it.
Yep.
From a cost point of view, from a time point of view.
Yeah, and I think most of it's unreasonable. You hear those types of things come up. All right, so big data privacy concerns. So privacy concerns are driving the risk as well, right? There's highly unsettled attitudes about privacy. It feels like we're very willing to give up data, back to our rewards cards or whatever else it may be, but if there's any type of perceived abuse of our data or misuse of our data, we're angry, right? And we want to punish and we want to go after people. I've given you all this data, but how dare you use it in this fashion? Whether it's domestic or international regulatory requirements, they're varying by industry, by data type, not to mention different countries. So again, when you start storing this data, because you may need it eventually, it can be pretty overwhelming of what's happening as these kind of views change. Other thing I'd say is big data non-compliance with stated privacy policies. We've seen quite a few things coming up, and I think we're going to see more and more of this from an investigation and lawsuit standpoint. And one that's still going on now, which is unclear to me where it's going to end up, is that this sort of non-warrant conditions when law enforcement shows up at an organization and says, give me your data about so-and-so, turn all this data over to me. There's only a few companies, I think, that have a stance on this, but as companies collect more and more data about people, there's going to be more situations where they come in and say there's some type of legal issue and we want data turned over. Yes, sir?
I think there's a piece of legislation in California about users being able to request their own data.
Yep. Yeah, requesting your data. I've seen a bunch of strange things about employers wanting your passwords to get into social networks to look at data. But a lot of it is there's some cases in certain states, but there's some uncertainty, I would say, about what that really means. So this article actually here is about the whole Google Why Spygate. Everyone remember that one? Where, again, the street, let's not even talk about the street view and the people that think about privacy there, but they were driving around and they found all these open Wi-Fi hotspots and they said, ooh, look at all this more data for us to get, right? And then they end up collecting a whole bunch of things which include personal information and all kinds of stuff. And so I would ask you, do you think Google did anything wrong here? They were driving this car around, there were open Wi-Fi, doors wide open, and they just collected what they could. Did they do something wrong? Raise your hand if you think they did something wrong. About half of you. There's a lot of people that think they did absolutely nothing wrong here. What did they do? It was open. The door was open. They just sort of looked in as they drove by, right? But in this particular case, they settled for $7 million, I believe. And if you talk to anyone related to that, it was sort of like, let's just make this go away. I think they make millions and millions every hour. So $7 million was like nothing for them just to say, let's make it go away. And it was those situations where, hey, we might have a good idea for data later on. Wouldn't it be really neat to have a map of everything? So let's just do that, right? Here's another one. Has anyone heard of Kouns before? These guys are, you heard, yeah? They're based in Virginia, and they collect a whole bunch of data about you, in many cases secretly, and then they sell it to firms about yourself. And so judge just awarded a class action status for them because they were secretly collecting and selling social security numbers, passwords, and personal data, right? So again, they're collecting everything, and then they're using it in a fashion that's causing them problems. And then Facebook, there's so many of them. If you actually, Facebook and privacy lawsuits, you get quite a few of them. But I think you guys have seen this one that started mid last year. It's about $15 billion privacy class action lawsuit. And this is another one for tracking. This wasn't the one where they were using profile in sponsor stories where they were, you gave them photos, but then they were using the photo to come up in a sponsor story where you didn't give them permission. That's another one. This is the one where you left Facebook and you supposedly deleted your account, but they were still tracking you, right? So again, we're seeing these things where you're sharing, but there's still this privacy issue. So let's talk about what can we do. And there was some good dialogue earlier, but let's talk about a couple things. So in terms of risk, we can talk about avoiding it, right? So first, we want to recognize the liability. Really understand the data can be your most important asset, but at the same time, there's serious financial risk with it. Be smart about what you're collecting. Maybe be a little bit more purposeful about what you're collecting. Again, don't be a big data hoarder just for the sake of being a hoarder. And it's not data forever, just the right data for the time that you need it. And this potentially will help you avoid some things. Now, are people going to do this? I don't know, right? I mean, we're seeing that people believe that there's value in the data. So then we get in kind of the acceptance phase of risk, right? And I think many of us may just need to accept the fact that organizations are going to store as much as they're able to get their hands on. And that's what they're going to do, and they're going to continue to do that. And I could stand up here, or any of you could say, hey, there's a liability associated with it, but it's not going to stop us from potential business value. And in most cases, it maybe shouldn't if that's what the business model suggests. So in this particular case, you might want to accept the potential financial costs associated with a breach or any of these other privacy lawsuits, right? Just something that is part of doing business. From a mitigation standpoint, I think we need to start being a little bit more firm that everyone needs to understand their customers, where they're located, states, countries, industries. Ensure that we have clear privacy policies, right? They shouldn't be vague. They should be very clear about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. Again, ensure that you customers have the ability to opt in and opt out. Basic stuff, we were talking about a session before, control access to your data, however big or small it is. Those traditional security controls, they still apply to your big data, right? It shouldn't be something that you say, oh, no big deal. But we're seeing that, we're not seeing those same level of controls around it so far. Hopefully that's going to change. And then I'll put in here, implement encryption. You could argue data masking. But yes, it is possible. And again, what we're talking about with big data potentially is putting all your data in one spot, and so you're aggregating or creating more systemic risk. And so you need to be mindful of that and control it. I think you get a lot of people that start saying things that, well, it's so big now, encryption doesn't work, or these masking techniques don't work. There definitely are challenges, but it can be done, and if you want to mitigate that, you need to look into those. And then also from a risk transfer standpoint, some of you know I've been on the bandwagon about this for a while, but I do believe that when you accept some risk and you're going to want to continue to have data and you know that there's potential costs with it, you can evaluate insurance for it. And from a standpoint of cyber liability or some kind of tech E&O, errors emissions insurance, it's available out there. There are first-party coverages that are associated with restoring systems. So if something happens and you need to restore all that big data, there's financial support there. There's coverage for other first parties, such as the notification and the monitoring. And then we even have the third-party liability. So, typically that's if you've harmed someone else and then lawsuits come to you. But if you look at some of these policies now, they have statements in there that will say if you have some type of lawsuit about a stated privacy policy violation, right? So if you're providing a service and you say you're going to do something with your customer's data and you do something differently that leads to a lawsuit, there can be insurance there that will defend you. Fines and penalties and a whole bunch of other things, extortion, et cetera, can be covered. There are some very gray spaces with coverage because there's still gray spaces with the technology and legal that's out there, but it is an option. So in closing, I've got the sign at me. I think be strategic and just don't be a sheep about it, right? Is big data really good for your organization? Have some conversations before you just start, saying you're in the big data game. Is there a legitimate business case, or is this something that one of your management folks has seen on a magazine cover while traveling on an airplane, saying that we need to get us some big data as well? With big data, it requires understanding of that liability and cost associated with storing all of it. And I think everyone also needs to start evaluating where you're putting your data, a little bit of a kind of asset control around it. We're hearing more and more big data in the cloud, right? So that seems to be the next, put all your data in the cloud. And I guess I'd just leave you with closing, actively manage your risk and liability of your data. Not saying that you should or should not collect data or hoard data or anything like that, but just be understanding of the liability that's there and make sure you have precautions or controls in place. And with that, I guess I'm all done. I appreciate your conversation and sticking with it. I'm around if you want to talk, but thank you very much.
So nobody has the room after this, so if you want to do some questions, that's no problem. But Mr. Mon, you're trying to do your session evaluation.
Thanks. Yeah, Mr. Christie.
So you briefly mentioned it, but there seems to me to be a pretty big tension between the kind of data that you would collect for incident response and forensics versus every other kind of data that's privacy related or whatever.
Yep.
Do you know of organizations that are struggling with this tension, and how are they resolving it? Does it ultimately come down to who has access to which kind of data, or does it actually influence what data gets collected?
Yeah, so I'm not sure organizations are strategic enough to have those kind of conversations yet. It sort of feels like store everything and then we're going to figure out what can help us answer that. From an incident standpoint, everything that I've seen so far really is about log data and access control data and those types of maybe traditional security data points. But we've started to see other organizations, financial organizations, using big data and profiling to detect fraud. So it's blurring, right? So, access control or log data before might not have been enough, but if you're starting to see how they act or behaved on the website, behavioral stuff that was mentioned or those types of things, that might identify that, hey, that's not a user in there, that's Zeus in there trying to do stuff, and we know that's a fraudulent transfer, let's stop that. So I think the problem is get everything and we'll see what the patterns are, and that's why there isn't a clear situation. But are there any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on data versus security data? Is there a difference? I think that's all we got for you, Christy. Yes, sir.
I'll make a comment just coming out of the packet capture talk.
Sure.
It would seem to me that if you're capturing packet traffic and stuff at that level, you're capturing all the data.
You're capturing everything.
Yeah, just because it's maybe obfuscated a little bit.
Yep.
You need somebody who knows Wireshark.
Yeah.
But it's still there.
Yep. Yep.
Does the law distinguish clear text from base 64 encoding? I don't know.
Well, and I don't know. And again, going back to the Google one that we discussed, there's a lot of people that really don't think they did anything wrong. That it was out there, and we just what did we do wrong? And so I think again, when there's that perceived idea of privacy violation, that's when things are getting escalated. So I don't know if there's a letter of the law more. It seems more emotional at this point as they figure things out. I will say, again, getting into the whole warrant type stuff, the Fourth Amendment is very gray. And I think you heard, in the keynote earlier, that the Fourth Amendment sort of doesn't, in the digital world, exist so much. And you could argue, and there's people that will, but going and opening a piece of mail is a clear violation, but you're seeing now that opening email, well, there's nothing there. So you're seeing so much uncertainty right now that I think, again, that's one of the reasons it's driving this more liability, because we don't know the answers. Anything else? Yeah, sure.
All right, so you're a cyber insurer.
Sure.
Have you ever put any kind of rider in a policy concerning data management policies and what you will cover and what you won't cover?
So again, every carrier does things differently.
Right.
I'll kind of broad brush things.
Okay.
There isn't so much, I'll say, a rider in a policy about it, but what you're trying to do is when submissions come in, you're trying to understand what they're doing, how they're controlling the data, what type of data they have, and that will determine if you're going to underwrite and provide your policy. We'll call them exclusions. If we can add an exclusion on there, if we come to find out that you're a company and you're doing tons of big data, you've got millions and millions of records per se, and we don't think the controls are in there, a carrier has an option to say, I'm just going to straight decline you, I'm going to charge you a ton of money, or they can exclude certain things perhaps within the coverage. But in general, I don't think the whole industry is sophisticated enough to really understand when that's appropriate to do that. Does that make okay? So, and then the other thing is carriers are really good about using sublimits, right? So you got to be careful sometimes when someone will say to you, do you have coverage? You say, yeah, we can totally cover that. Come to find out you may have $50,000 of notification and credit monitoring. For a small breach, that's totally fine. For a larger breach, that's not. So, saying that there's coverage and then determining how much is really important.